Organs Without Bodies. Deleuze and Consequences. By Slavoj Zizek. Blows against the empire. Today's global capitalism can no longer be combined with democratic representation. The key economic decisions of bodies like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, or World Trade Organization, WTO, are not legitimized by any democratic process, and this lack of democratic representation is structural, not empirical. For this reason, the call for a global, representative, democracy that would submit the IMF, WTO, and other agencies to some kind of democratic control, voiced, in Germany, by Habermas, Beck, Lafontaine, and others, is illusory. Can one really even imagine a worldwide vote for the board of the IMF? We are dealing with more than the usual complaint that parliamentary democracy is formal here, even the form is absent. Hart and Negri's empire aims at providing a solution to this predicament. Their wager is to repeat Marx. For Marx, highly organized corporate capitalism was already a form of socialism within capitalism, a kind of socialization of capitalism, with the absent owners becoming superfluous, so that one need only cut the nominal head off and we get socialism. In an identical fashion, Hart and Negri see the same potential in the emerging hegemonic role of immaterial labor. Today, immaterial labor is hegemonic in the precise sense in which Marx proclaimed that, in 19th century capitalism, large industrial production was hegemonic as the specific color giving its tone to the totality, not quantitatively but playing the key, emblematic structural role. This, then, far from posing a mortal threat to democracy, as conservative cultural critics want us to believe, opens up a unique chance of absolute democracy. Why? In immaterial production, the products are no longer material objects but new social, interpersonal, relations themselves. It was already Marx who emphasized how material production is always also the reproduction of the social relations within which it occurs. With today's capitalism, however, the production of social relations is the immediate end/goal of production. The wager of Hart and Negri is that this directly socialized, immaterial production not only renders owners progressively superfluous, who needs them when production is directly social, formally and as to its content, the producers also master the regulation of social space, since social relations, politics, is the stuff of their work. The way is thus open for absolute democracy, for the producers directly regulating their social relations without even the detour of democratic representation. The problem here is, at a minimum, triple. First, can one really interpret this move toward the hegemonic role of immaterial labor as the move from production to communication, to social interaction, i.e., in Aristotelian terms, from techne as poiesis to praxis? Does it really indicate the overcoming of the Arendtian distinction between production and vis activa, or of the Habermasian distinction between instrumental and communicational reason? Second, how does this politicization of production, in which production directly produces new social relations, affect the very notion of politics? Is such an administration of people, subordinated to the logic of profit, still politics, or is it the most radical sort of depoliticization, the entry into post-politics? And last but not least, is democracy not by necessity, with regard to its very notion, non-absolute? There is no democracy without a hidden, presupposed elitism. Democracy is, by definition, not global, it has to be based on values or truths that one cannot select democratically. In democracy one can fight for truth but not decide what is truth. As Claude Lefort and others amply demonstrated, democracy is never simply representative in the sense of adequately representing, expressing, a pre-existing set of interests, opinions, and so forth, since these interests and opinions are constituted only through such representation. In other words, the democratic articulation of an interest is always minimally performative. Through their democratic representatives people establish what their interests and opinions are. As Hegel already knew, absolute democracy could actualize itself only in the guise of its oppositional determination, as terror. There is, thus, a choice to be made here: do we accept democracy's structural, not just accidental, imperfection, or do we also endorse its terroristic dimension? Hart and Negri's slogan "Multitude as the site of resistance against the empire" opens up a further series of problems, the primary one among them being the level at which a multitude functions, what a given field of multitudes excludes, what it has to exclude to function. There is, hence, always a non-multiple excess over multitudes. Take multiculturalist identity politics. Yes, a thriving multitude of identities, religious, ethnic, sexual, cultural, asserted against the specter of antiquated class reductionism and essentialism. However, it was noted long ago by many a perspicacious observer, in the mantra of class, gender, race, class sticks out, never properly thematized. Another case of such a homogenization of multitudes is capital itself. Capitalism is multiplicity in principle. Totally monopolistic capital is conceptual nonsense, but, precisely as such, it needs a universal medium as the sole domain within which its multitude can thrive, the medium of a legally regulated market in which contracts are respected and their breach punished, and so on. In what I would call a properly dialectical move, Ecobedo Laca points out how it was only when the process of centralization in the early modernity had advanced beyond a certain point that something resembling a unitary multitude could emerge through the transference of sovereignty from the king to the people. In other words, one cannot simply oppose the subversive immanent multitude to the centralizing transcendent state power. It was the very establishment of a centralized state power in the 17th and 18th centuries that created the space for the emergence of the modern political multitude in the first place. So, to ask a naive question, what would multitude in power, not only as resistance, be? How would it function? Hart and Negri distinguish two ways to oppose the global capitalist empire: either the protectionist advocacy of the return to the strong nation-state or the deployment of even more flexible forms of multitude. Along these lines, in his analysis of the Porto Alegre anti-globalist meeting, Hart emphasizes the new logic of political space at work there. It was no longer the old us versus them binary logic, with the Leninist call for a FIRM, singular party line, but the coexistence of a multitude of political agencies and positions that are incompatible with each other as far as their ideological and programmatic accents are concerned, from conservative farmers and ecologists worried about the fate of their local tradition and patrimony to human rights groups and agents standing for the interests of immigrants, advocating global mobility. It is, effectively, today's opposition to global capital that seems to provide a kind of negative mirror image in relation to Deleuze's claim about the inherently antagonistic nature of capitalist dynamics, a strong machine of deterritorialization that generates new modes of reterritorialization. Today's resistance to capitalism reproduces the same antagonism. Calls for the defense of particular, cultural, ethnic, identities being threatened by global dynamics coexist with the demands for more global mobility, against the new barriers imposed by capitalism, which concern, above all, the free movement of individuals. Is it, then, true that these tendencies, these lignes de foot, as Deleuze would have put it, can coexist in a non-antagonistic way, as parts of the same global network of resistance? One is tempted to answer this claim by applying to it Lacan's notion of the chain of equivalences. Of course, this logic of multitude functions, because we are still dealing with resistance. However, what about when, if this really is the desire and will of these movements, we take it over? What would the multitude in power look like? There was a similar constellation in the last years of the decaying really existing socialism, the non-antagonistic coexistence, within the oppositional field, of a multitude of ideologico-political tendencies, from liberal human rights groups to liberal business-oriented groups, conservative religious groups and leftist workers' demands. This multitude functioned well as long as it was united in the opposition to them, the party hegemony. Once they found themselves in power, the game was over. Another case of acting multitude is the crowd that brought back into power Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. However, can we forget the obvious fact that Chavez functions as a Latino American caudillo, the unique leader whose function is to magically resolve the conflicting interests of those who support him. Multitude in power thus necessarily actualizes itself in the guise of an authoritarian leader whose charisma can serve as the empty signifier able to contain the multitude of interests. It was already Péron who was a militaristic patriot to the army, a devout Christian to the church, a supporter of the poor against oligarchy on behalf of workers, etc. The favored example of the supporters, and practitioners, of the new, dispersed counterpower of the multitude is, of course, the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico. Here is Naomi Klein's description of how its leading figure, Subcommandant Marcos, functions. He wasn't a commander barking orders, but a subcommandant, a conduit for the will of the councils. His first words, in his new persona, were "Through me speaks the will of the Zapatista National Liberation Army." Further subjugating himself, Marcos says to those who seek him out that he is not a leader, but that his black mask is a mirror, reflecting each of their own struggles, that a Zapatista is anyone anywhere fighting injustice, that we are you. Most famously, he once told a reporter that Marcos is gay in San Francisco, black in South Africa, an Asian in Europe, a Chicano in San Isidro, an anarchist in Spain, a Palestinian in Israel. A single woman on the metro at 10 p.m. A peasant without land, a gang member in the slums. Meanwhile, Marcos himself, the supposed non-self, the conduit, the mirror, writes in a tone so personal and poetic, so completely and unmistakably his own. It is clear that such a structure can function only as the ethico-poetic shadowy double of the existing positive state power structure. No wonder Marcos cannot show his face. No wonder his idea is to throw off his mask and disappear back into anonymity if and when the movement reaches its goals. If the Zapatistas were to effectively take power, statements like "Through me speaks the will of" would immediately acquire a much more ominous dimension. Their apparent modesty would reveal itself as extreme arrogance, as the presumption of one particular individual that his subjectivity serves as a direct medium of expression for the universal will. Do we still remember how phrases like "I am nothing in myself, my entire strength is yours, I am just an expression of your will," was the standard cliché of totalitarian leaders, who also knew very well how to manipulate their dark implication? So anyone who attacks me personally is effectively attacking you all, the entire people, your love for freedom and justice. The greater the poetic potential of Marcos in opposition, as a critical voice of virtual protest, the greater would be the terror of Marcos as an actual leader. As to the political effects of the Zapatista movement, one should note the final irony here, when Klein lists as the main Zapatista political achievement that this movement helped topple the corrupt 71-year reign of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. What this amounts to is that, with Zapatista help, Mexico got the FARST post-revolutionary government, a government that cut the last links with the historical heritage of Zapata and fully endorsed Mexico's integration into the neo-liberal New World Order. No wonder the two presidents, Fox, ex-boss of the Mexican branch of Coca-Cola, and Bush, are personal friends. However, is it not that the Zapatistas did develop a minimal, positive political program, that of local self-determination, of moving in where state power failed and enabling people to constitute new spaces of local community democracy? What sets the Zapatistas apart from your average Marxist guerrilla insurgents is that their goal is not to win control but to seize and build autonomous spaces where democracy, liberty, and justice can thrive. Marcos is convinced that these free spaces, born of reclaimed land, communal agriculture, resistance to privatization, will eventually create counterpowers to the state simply by existing as alternatives. And yet, we encounter here the same ambiguity. Are these autonomous spaces germs of the organization to come of the entire society, or just phenomena emerging in the crevices and gaps of the social order? Marcos's formulation that the Zapatistas are not interested in the revolution but, rather, in a revolution that makes revolution possible is deeply true, but nonetheless profoundly ambiguous. Does this mean that the Zapatistas are a cultural revolution laying the foundation for the actual political revolution, what, way back in the 1960s, Marcuse called freedom as the condition of liberation, or does it mean that they should remain merely a site of resistance, a corrective to the existing state power, not only without the aim to replace it but also without the aim to organize the conditions in which this power will disappear? When Marcos lists all those covered by the signifier Zapatista, all those rendered invisible by neoliberal globalization, it's excluded, the indigenous, youth, women, homosexuals, lesbians, people of color, immigrants, workers, peasants. This effectively sounds like Lacan's chain of equivalences. However, with the twist that this chain clearly refers to a privileged central signifier, that of neoliberal global capitalism. So, when Klein herself had to note how the Zapatista movement is keenly aware of the power of words and symbols, when Marcos proclaims that words are his weapons, one should neither joyfully assert how we are dealing with a truly postmodern politics of the signifier, nor should one indulge in cynical quips about how the Zapatistas are well versed in mobilizing the fetishizing power of logos, the focus of Naomi's bestseller. One should, rather, reflect on how this use of mythical poetic master signifiers affects the actual political impact of the movement. If the defenders of the Zapatistas were to reply here that, in this case, the central master signifier is not a totalizing homogenizing force but just a kind of empty container, a designation that holds open the space for the thriving of the irreducible plurality, one should add to that this, precisely, is how master signifiers already functioned in fascism and populism, in which the reference to a charismatic leader serves to neutralize the inconsistent multitude of ideological references. The response of the partisans of Negri and Hart to this critique is, of course, that it continues to perceive the new situation from within the old framework. In the contemporary information society, the question of taking power is more and more irrelevant since there is no longer any central power agency that plays a de facto decisive role. Power itself is shifting, decentered, protean. Perhaps, then, today, in the epoch of Homo sacer, one of the options is to pursue the trend of self-organized collectives in areas outside the law. Recall life in today's favelas in Latin American megalopolises. Are they, in some sense, not the first liberated territories, the cells of futural self-organized societies? Are institutions like community kitchens not a model of socialized communal local life? And, perhaps, from this standpoint, one can also approach, in a new way, the politics of drugs. Was it really an accident that, at every moment that a strong self-organized collective of those outside the law emerged, it was soon corrupted by hard drugs from African American ghettos after the rebellions in the 1960s and Italian cities after the workers' unrests of the 1970s up to today's favelas? And the same holds even for Poland after Jaruzelski's coup in 1980. All of a sudden, drugs were easily available, together with pornography, alcohol, and Eastern wisdom manuals, in order to ruin the self-organized civil society. Those in power knew full well when to use drugs as a weapon against self-organized resistance. However, what about the complex network of material, legal, institutional, and other conditions that must be maintained for the informational multitude to be able to function? Naomi Klein writes, decentralizing power doesn't mean abandoning strong national and international standards and stable, equitable funding for healthcare, education, affordable housing, and environmental protection. But it does mean that the mantra of the left needs to change from increase funding to empower the grassroots, and so one should ask the naive question, how? How are these strong standards and funding, in short, the main ingredients of the welfare state, to be maintained? No wonder that, in a kind of ironic twist proper to the cunning of reason, Hart and Negri end their empire with a minimal positive political program of 3 points, the demand for global citizenship, so that the mobility of the working force under the present capitalist conditions is recognized, the right to a social wage, a minimal income guaranteed to everybody, the right to reappropriation, so that the key means of production, especially those of new informational media, are socially owned. The irony here is not only the content of these demands, with which, in abstractu, every radical liberal or social democrat would agree, but their very form writes, demands, which unexpectedly brings back into the picture what the entire book was fighting against. Political agents all of a sudden appear as subjects of universal rights, demanding their realization, from whom, if not some universal form of legal state power. In short, psychoanalytic terms, from the nomadic schizo outside the law we pass to the hysterical subject trying to provoke the master by way of bombarding him with impossible demands. Brian Masumi writes, the way that a concept like hope can be made useful is when it is not connected to an expected success, when it starts to be something different from optimism, because when you start trying to think ahead into the future from the present point, rationally there really isn't much room for hope. Globally it's a very pessimistic affair, with economic inequalities increasing in many regions, with the global effects of environmental deterioration already being felt, with conflicts among nations and peoples apparently only getting more intractable, leading to mass displacements of workers and refugees. It seems such a mess that I think it can be paralyzing. On the other hand, if hope is separated from concepts of optimism and pessimism, from a wishful projection of success or even some kind of rational calculation of outcomes, then I think it starts to be interesting because it places it in the present. One should bear in mind the radical ambiguity of this position, the suspension of the teleological dimension, the immersion into the now, the fact that the process of liberation already has to practice freedom. All this remains tainted by the suspicion that the focus on the now constitutes a desperate strategic retreat from the hopelessness of any approach based on the more global cognitive mapping of the situation.